Hello, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome to this Rand Europe webinar. My name is Ben Horton. I'm the head of communications at Rand Europe. And I'm delighted that you can join us today for this discussion on European deterrence and the threat of Russia. As war continues to rage in Ukraine, Europe's leaders face tough questions over many years of underinvestment in their armed forces. At the urging of the United States, many European NATO members have committed to bolster their defence capabilities, and in 2025 we've seen significant flows of money pledged towards this effort. But Europe remains particularly reliant on the protection extended to it by the US nuclear deterrent. So, what are the capabilities that Europe needs to effectively deter Russia and other hostile actors? What role can the British and French nuclear deterrents play, and what is the right balance to strike between conventional and nuclear assets? And in a month where Russia has flown fighter jets into Estonia's airspace and drones into Poland's, what do we know of how Moscow views the state of European deterrence? So, over the next hour, we've got a wonderful lineup of speakers from across Europe to delve into these questions. I'm delighted to be joined by Paul Van Hooft, a senior research leader in RAND Europe's Defence, Security and Justice team based in The Hague, Emmanuel Maitre, a senior research fellow at the Foundation for Strategic Research in Paris, and Sophia Walford, an analyst in RAND Europe's Defence, Security and Justice team here in the UK. Thank you all for being here with me. Before we kick off, a few points of housekeeping. This event is taking place on the record, and a video will be made available after the discussion. Feel free to share what you hear today on social media. If you're on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, or X, then please do tag Rand Europe. We will also have time for audience Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, please type it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I'll get to as many of these as possible. So let's get into the discussion, and I'd love to start with you, Paul, if I may. As I mentioned, this month the war in Ukraine has continued. We've seen increasing sort of strikes from Russia in that particular conflict, while they also test waters in infringing on NATO airspace in Estonia and in Poland. So I just wondered if you could begin with giving us your sense of the security landscape that Europe faces this autumn and the real nature of the threat that Russia poses.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ben. Thank you for the introduction. I think the threat has many different facets, or there are many different factors at play. What Russia is trying to do is to test the boundaries of the alliance to see how far they can push it without the alliance responding, or to kind of push some of the allies into responding before other allies are ready. Right? So by intruding into the airspace of some of the Baltic states and Poland, if we don't reply, if NATO doesn't respond, that's to Russia's benefit. If NATO or some parts of NATO respond too strongly, that's also to Russia's benefit, right? Russia's strategy here is primarily to first split apart the alliance as much as possible. Now, the larger picture here is that in some sense, the alliance is already less cohesive than it was 10 or 20 years ago, certainly than it was during the Cold War. So the US has long signaled that it was prioritizing the Indo-Pacific over Europe. And the Trump administration has, I think, has made that more explicit than the Biden administration or than the first Trump administration or the Obama administration did. Pete Hegseth, the now Secretary of War, said very clearly when he visited Germany beginning of this year that Europe was no longer the priority for the US. And there are signals that the new National Defense Strategy and the Global Posture Review will go a bit further in that, and that there will be the number one and two priorities will be either the homeland, the US homeland, and Asia, right? But in any case, Europe will be the third, and maybe the third by some distance. So that sets up a whole picture which is quite disturbing already. So Russia's testing the boundaries of the alliance, and the alliance is just sort of not as focused as it was during the Cold War or the few decades that followed the Cold War. So that's why there's a real demand now for Europeans, writ large, but specifically the two nuclear-armed European states, the UK and France, to do a lot more to deter Russia. And we have to think through what do we do in all these scenarios when the political threat is large, but maybe the military threat is not yet as clear, or certainly it isn't existential.
Thanks very much, Paul. Could you just unpack that last point you just made there about the distinction between the political threat and the kind of military threat?
Yeah, so we're dealing with a very different situation than we were during the Cold War, where then there was a real threat that the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies or client states would engage in massive conventional warfare and be able to actually invade and occupy parts of Western Europe. Russia is not really positioned to do that, certainly not to do anything close to that, as long as it hasn't settled the war in Ukraine, and that doesn't seem to be settling anytime soon. And in those circumstances, what it really needs to do is to unsettle the alliance, to break it apart politically. It can do this in several ways. The intrusions with manned and unmanned aircraft are one way to do this. For at least a decade, we've been thinking about the occupation of parts of NATO member states' territories, such as in the Baltics. But we could think of the Swedish island or a part of northern Finland. An interest that is a clear violation of NATO security guarantees, of NATO territory, but that is not yet something where you can truly say that European security writ large is at risk. Under those circumstances, you need to have an answer, and the answer cannot immediately cannot be to either do nothing or to escalate to extreme levels of violence. Right? And that's I think the problem where Europe finds itself. There's a lot of scenarios which are not existential, not even existential perhaps for a part of Europe, but that are still serious and are still a serious political threat to the cohesion of the alliance.
That's great. Thank you. I'm aware, by the way, that my sound might be a little bit muffled, but I hope people can hear me well. Um, so let's talk a bit about the capabilities that Europe has to build its kind of own deterrence. I mean, what really is the gap that we're talking about? As you mentioned, Paul, at the start, you know, if there is a situation where US priorities are elsewhere in the world, what would that mean? What are the kind of capabilities that Europe has at its disposal now, and which it might need to develop?
Yeah. So I think when we speak about deterrence up to and including nuclear weapons, then the US um, has provided extended deterrence to NATO European allies since since the start of the Cold War. Yet the US has also had literally a huge nuclear arsenal, but also a very varied arsenal of responses. So it has many options to respond to different levels of Soviet or Russian aggression, and then to kind of reciprocate in kind or to kind of fine-tune a response. That is not the case for the European states. So the UK and France have, at the highest level of threat, have sufficient nuclear weapons to cause unacceptable damage to Russia. So through the destruction of St. Petersburg, Moscow, right? Really the centers of Russian society, the state, the economy, and so on. Yet at scenarios which are far from existential or are, yeah, serious security threats, but not close to that state of survival being at stake, those are more difficult to respond to. So that's why there's now a lot of discussion about how to think more about conventional weapons, and there's a lot more work now a lot more attention being paid to political signaling of that kind of cohesion and a greater role for France and the UK.
Thanks so much, Paul. And I
hope everybody that my sound is now better. I'm wearing a very glamorous call center headset now, so yeah, aesthetically, I've gone back, but hopefully you can hear me. That's the important thing. Emmanuel, I would love to bring you in here. Paul's obviously just spoken there about uh, the kind of additional responsibilities that the UK and France are going to have to bear in this context. I wondered if you could maybe give us the perspective from France on that, and maybe tell us a bit about the capabilities that France has it at its disposal, and what you know of its kind of readiness or willingness to play this more advanced role for Europe.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. I think indeed the Russian threat is very central in the way that France is considering its deterrence and defense posture. We've seen it in the latest document that was published this July, the strategic review. And here, of course, there are different dimensions. The nuclear deterrence dimension is very much apart from the rest because in the French doctrine, there is a clear separation of what falls in the realm of nuclear deterrence and what is under that threshold. And of course, cannot be, there's no continuity between the two. But it's interesting nonetheless to see that there is in the latest document, in the latest strategic review, consideration and an interrogation of how well this nuclear deterrence is performing to deter Russia. And here I can reassure everybody up front. So according to the French government, the nuclear deterrence has been successful so far against Russia, and in the idea of especially the narrative is that Russia has failed to prevent NATO countries from assisting Ukraine, and that this is because of the ability of NATO countries, the three nuclear powers within NATO, to credibly have deterrence being backed by nuclear deterrence. And the review also concludes that, I'm quoting, the fundamentals of France's deterrence doctrine remains perfectly suited to the current situation. So there's this idea that the question of whether or not the doctrine, the strategy, the capacities are enough in a context which is radically changed since the format was defined after the Cold War. This question is raised, and there's an answer which is rather positive, even if the document also mentions that these changes in the strategic environment may call for ensuring the relevance of the capability choices made, as well as the appropriate scale of their conventional support. So we have here two ideas that I think are very interesting. The first one is there's no exclusion that at one point or another there might be a need to change maybe the format. This is something that is very much up to the president. At this stage, there's no recognition that we need to, for instance, increase the number of nuclear weapons, such as has been done in the UK. This is not something at all that France has judged necessary at this stage, but it's not excluded either. There's, of course, modernization programs to try to ensure that the next the various components will be using and employing updated weapons. Of course, for instance, hypersonic cruise missile for the air forces, a new generation of nuclear submarines. So this is, of course, something that is taken into consideration. And there are also some things that are a little bit ambiguous or vague. For instance, in March, the president announced that a new an airbase in Luxeuil would be again considered as part of the strategic airbase. So would be the first one to receive the Rafale with the new nuclear cruise missiles. We don't know quite if it's in addition to what exists or if it's some of the other Rafale deployed on other bases being moved to this one. But we can see that there is internal thinking about to what extent the posture is in itself and for France itself is fitted to the challenges. And then there's, of course, the European dimension.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, could you unpack that a little bit more for us? That just on that last point around the European dimension, I'd both love to get a sense of what you see as kind of how France is kind of seeing this these capabilities now? Is it primarily a kind of national deterrent? Is it about the security of France, or is it now about kind of extending that across wider Europe? And I wondered also a bit about um, how you think France's statements this year and its general kind of strategic positioning have kind of been received by its allies.
Sure. So here again, quite interesting because there's always this effort in the French strategy thinking to try to make sure that, or to insist on the fact that that this continuity with the past, it's not brand new. We've been mentioning this European dimension for many years. Even if we go back to the time of Charles de Gaulle and others, there was this idea that France is not isolated, it's not an island. So obviously, if it's attacked, it means others are attacked, and there is a great probability that it's been involved in the conflict way before its actual borders are being attacked. Here again, I think the strategic review has tried to make the effort to synthesize a little bit both these ideas and the novelties that we've seen with the President Macron, which really emphasized that notion, I think, both for domestic reasons and the fact that it's in line with this vision of France and Europe really working together, but also, as Paul mentioned, because there was clearly a need and a vacuum created a little bit by the US behavior. So I think there are several dimensions that should be mentioned, and also limitations which are specified in the review. The idea that, of course, the decision to use weapons, the nuclear deterrence, is strictly in the hand of the French president. That is really a central element. The second one I think is interesting. It's mentioning that France, the doctrine emphasizes the strategic nature of nuclear weapons and reject any tactical use, which is something we might want to go back to later. And of course, the fact that the offer made to Europeans will not detract from the requirements of our national deterrence. So whatever is done is in addition to something which is maybe we could see as the core deterrent. We must be able to defend ourselves, by ourselves, for ourselves in any last situation, last resort. But of course, we can do more. And I think that's really what has been pushed by President Macron with, at the highest level, political commitment, political signaling, whether it is by his own declarations, whether it is, for instance, in the latest treaties. We have seen it with the French-German security and defense treaty, where this idea of solidarity and that it might go as all the way to nuclear deterrence is quite explicit. Then we've had a series of, and it's completely ongoing in the really in the vein of what the president has been pushing for, political, technical dialogues on what are the requirements, how this might work, which goes a little bit beyond what was usually the French authorities are going to explain how the deterrence work. I think this is more of a dialogue now going on with many countries. I could mention again Germany, of course, but also Poland, Nordic countries, others that have shown some interest. And here we have already this type of idea that maybe we can think creatively about how French nuclear deterrence may be a part of a bigger whole in which we have different deterrence and defense capabilities. And here the kind of consistency and complementarity that we can have between this force and, of course, conventional defensive capacities, intelligence, cyber, and so on and so forth. We've seen some efforts to do some specific signaling. Of course, the idea of partners taking part in exercises has been mentioned at the highest level, but of course, flying some aircrafts from the strategic force is also a way to signal, and we've seen that in Poland a couple of weeks ago. And lastly, maybe the coordination with the UK, which is a step further that was announced in July as well, with the idea that possibly we can see this emerging really that some way of coordination, which once again does not at all limit the sovereignty or the autonomy of both forces, but some level of coordination may increase the efficiency of both national deterrence and the way they can also protect better Europe. So I think these are the different levels that we've seen, from very political to a little bit more concrete. There's still very much to do. What I think is worth noting, and you evoked it in your introduction, is the reactions from European partners have changed over time. There was a lot of skepticism at some point, especially at the beginning in 2020, when President Macron made the first announcements. This idea that maybe it was a reflection of French ambition, its willingness to control a little bit security in Europe. I think now there's more appreciation of solidarity and the idea that it's really nice to see that France is actually living up to its commitments and thinking its security a little bit in a less isolated fashion. So that's, I would say, the positive element. Of course, there is some prudence because even if France has said it doesn't want to replace NATO or to hurt the NATO mechanisms in any way, there's always this fear that it might create an incentive or pretext for the US to actually pull back some forces. And some interrogations, some political interrogations, which I think are true for France, but are also true for the US as well, which is to what extent the voice of President Macron is going to prevail in the long run. Can we imagine some other leaders who might be much less committed towards Europe? So that's a very strong possibility. But here again, it is kind of a factor of democracies where leaders may change. And technical questions, and here maybe we are going to bounce back on that as well. We see some doubts or skepticism as to whether the smaller, of course, limited nuclear arsenal of France, around 300 weapons, can be enough to deter an adversary like Russia, and whether or not its strategic conception, refusal to have a nuclear escalation, no tactical weapons in the arsenal, whether or not this has an impact on the credibility.
Emmanuel, thank you so much. Paul, I'd like to come back to you, and I've got a couple of things actually that'd be great to get your reflection on. But first is what Emmanuel was just describing there at the end around the kind of perceived possible shift in France's posture in this regard, even if the claim is that actually there's continuity here. But what did you make of her sense of how Europe has responded to France's positioning here? And then sort of second point, I'd love to bring the UK into this picture. So anything you can share about the role that you think the UK can or is playing, and the role of its nuclear deterrent also.
No, thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you, Ben. And I think those are, I think this is a really good point to bring in, that the U.S. security guarantees, the extended nuclear deterrence guarantees, one of the reasons that many European allies are struggling with rethinking this is because they have become so used, right, for almost 80 years to the US doing this, and the US presidents, secretaries of defense, secretaries of state putting in tremendous amount of effort into making this believable. But I think it's good to point, and therefore France and the UK being relatively new to taking on such a role makes it a little uncomfortable. But I think it's worthwhile to point out that the US doing this has always been a very hard sell, right? It's very difficult for allies to believe, for very logical reasons, that the US would truly be willing to sacrifice New York, Chicago, Washington, Los Angeles on behalf of allies, either in Europe or Asia. And the US was able to do this because it put a tremendous amount of effort into it. It put hundreds of thousands of US troops in Europe so that if a war would happen, well, they would basically die and make it more reasonable for the US to escalate further. And allies knew this, and the Soviets knew this. This is all sort of took a long time to build. And if we look at most of the Cold War history, European allies were constantly, the pendulum was constantly swinging between two extremes. Either they thought the US was about to leave, or they thought that the US was about to have a nuclear war in Europe, right? So it's inherently a very difficult thing to do. And it's worthwhile pointing this out because what I think part of the French argument is now, is that it's not maybe necessary for France or the UK to kind of do a copy or do a find replace of what the US has done, because the US was doing something that was very hard, if not impossible to believe. It said, we will protect our allies, our friends on the other side of the ocean, both the Atlantic and the Pacific. We care about them so much, we'll protect them even if at the risk of our own survival, which means that the US had to have a lot more means to pressure the Soviets. And it had to do things that are we call damage limitation, right? It had to have some form of missile defense and some ways to kind of diminish the effect of Soviet and Russian and Chinese missile attacks. This is sort of all, a lot of things to kind of unpack there potentially, but it means that whatever France and UK can do, it does not have to be a carbon copy of what the US has done, because the strategic situation is entirely different. So I think some of the French argument is, and I find that believable, is that they do not need, they're not extending deterrence across the Atlantic. So therefore, whatever they need is less than what the US needs. And I think the same would apply to the UK. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is solved, because credibility, we often make this a discussion about certain kinds of capabilities, missile systems, ranges, whether you can deploy from aircraft or all these other things. But credibility is built from many different things, right? It's built from a constant practice of engagement, of sort of the habits that were built through NATO participation in the nuclear planning group. There's all these things that are sort of hard to kind of, get a clear metric on and say, well, if you do this, then there will be deterrence or reassurance of allies. But that's also sort of the thing that still needs to be built. I think for Europeans, there's a clear understanding that exclusively relying on the US is a thing of the past, but there's still sort of not the kind of the muscle reflexes to think about how to deal with France or the UK in this sense. France is on the one hand more autonomous, more independent, so therefore more credible. On the other hand, its nuclear weapons are not integrated in NATO like the British weapons are. So therefore, I can speak from the Dutch perspective on this, from people in government I've spoken to. There's at least that sense that, okay, we've worked with the Brits in these contexts many times, so we understand how they work and how they think. Those relationships are being built now with French planners, with French policymakers, and these are all proceeding, and still some of it is in the feeling out stage, some of it is a bit more concrete, but that is still an ongoing process, and you can't really replace 70 plus years of cooperation, from 1 week or 1 month to the next, with a system that is sort of similar but not exactly the same.
Thanks very much, Paul. I'm conscious of time, and we've got tons of really amazing questions coming in the Q&A section. So thanks. Keep those coming, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. But I feel like we've got an elephant in the room potentially in this conversation, which is, what does Russia actually think about European deterrence and European capabilities? And I'm glad to say that, in fact, that's something that RAND Europe knows a lot about. It's the subject of a recent research paper that was published over the summer. And I would love to bring in Sophia now to tell us a bit more about the research and about the findings of the research that you've got, and what we can tell really about how Moscow sees this picture and the sorts of signals that they would respond to.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, we did a study on that earlier this year, and the objective of that study was to better understand the Russian perceptions of the British and the French nuclear deterrence. For the study, we've reviewed quite a lot of publications by Russian military experts and analysts between 2010 and 2024. And in general, the findings of the study was that in the past, Russian military thinkers mostly focused on US nuclear capabilities in the context of NATO's deterrence posture. In fact, the bibliometric analysis that we did for the study showed that before 2014, British and French nuclear deterrence weren't really mentioned in Russian language academic publications. So that shows that when Russian military thinkers were considering NATO's nuclear deterrent, they were mostly thinking about US nuclear capabilities. Although we found some studies and analytical papers that focus on the British and the French deterrence. So when we focus a bit on Russian perceptions of the British deterrent, we found that most military thinkers were that the British nuclear deterrent is a credible deterrent that can cause unacceptable damage to adversaries. Also, Russian authors also often highlighted the UK's reliance on US delivery systems as major vulnerability. And
sorry, Sophia, just to interrupt. The connection isn't fantastic. I wonder if you could maybe just leave and rejoin the meeting, and it might help with the connectivity.
I'll do that.
Sorry to interrupt you mid flow.
That's okay.
Great. While Sophia's sort of having a go at sorting out this this connectivity, I wondered maybe if we go to some of the questions because they very much pick up to what Emmanuel and Paul you were talking about earlier. So I just wanted to pose a kind of scenario to you that Isabella has raised in the Q&A, which is really, what do we mean by kind of confronting or responding to Russia's incursions on the kind of eastern on the eastern flank. So Isabella asked, we've seen warnings by NATO allies that they will confront Russian fighter jets if they continue this behavior in NATO airspace. What do we understand by confront? Are we talking about shooting down Russian jets, or would we see other potentially less serious actions such as maneuvers in the air to warn the jets off? And what does it mean if we get to a point where NATO is shooting down Russian planes? Is that war, or is that just another aspect to deterring full-scale conflict? Paul, I don't know, would you like to have a first go at that?
Sure. I think that's an excellent question. Sort of a bit of all of the above, right? You'd start with warnings, you'd escort them out. But if at some point this would continue to happen, they would not respond to any of the warnings, then you should be able to respond how you would to a foreign state sending unwanted military equipment through your airspace, through your territory. Now, shooting down a Russian jet after such warnings, if it's clearly over NATO airspace, is a defensive measure. And after sufficient provocations from the Russian side, I think most of the alliance will accept it. But that is still might not necessarily deter Russia. And it might also be something that actually Russia would not be completely opposed to, right? There's two parts of the Russian provocation. It's either showing that the alliance does nothing, which makes the alliance look weak, which gives Russia more maneuver space, or it's to kind of provoke the alliance into replying, or at least parts of the alliance into replying. In which case, the Russians can say, "See, they're warmongers and they're so aggressive, and NATO is not a defensive alliance at all." But I don't think that shooting down a Russian plane under those circumstances is an act of war, right? It's the responsibility is on the Russian side. The key there is to prepare the story beforehand and to kind of make clear what is going on, to kind of make clear what the repercussions are, to establish, to use as much intelligence to establish, to show proof for the public debate that this is happening. In a way that one of the successes of the Biden administration in the period leading up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and just after, which was to share so much of the intelligence that allies that had been very skeptical of the US had been skeptical of, or had been very wary of kind of getting too confrontational with Russia. They had been provided intelligence beforehand, interpretations of those intelligence. They were still skeptical. And then when it happens, they actually kind of went through, okay, well, this clearly is actually, they were right. You know, they showed us the evidence, and we could also believe them better now in the future. Now, is it clear that the Trump administration would handle things in the same way? I'm not sure. But there is something in there to kind of make very clear what is happening, to show the evidence, to show the repercussions if it continues to happen, and then to act through on it. Because, and I'll just close off there, one part of deterrence, which I mentioned in my previous remarks, again, we can't just focus on the capabilities. You have to communicate the resolve to use capabilities. So if you have all these means with which you can defend and deter against Russia, but you make clear to both Russia and your own allies that you'll never use them, you basically don't have something that can deter, right? You need, at some point, if provoked enough, you need to actually demonstrate your willingness to use them. So I think in that way, it's a kind of a long answer to what seems in some ways a very simple question, but it's really about not just reacting, not just what, blowing up an airplane means, but also making sure you make clear what the airplane means, the aircraft intruding in your airspace means, and what your response to it means. Because if you lose that kind of informational part of it, that neither the deterrence nor the kind of escalation management part of this will still work as well.
Paul, thanks so much for taking that one. Sophia, you're back with us. Should we try that again, and hope that the connections maybe improved a little?
Yeah, I can try, but let me know if this is not working. Maybe it's just standard Central London internet. Okay, so hopefully it's better this time. So conscious of time, I'll just quickly summarize what we found regarding the Russian perceptions of the British and French deterrence. So just to jump back on the British deterrent, we found that quite a lot of Russian authors highlighted the UK's reliance on US delivery systems as a major vulnerability. And then when it comes to the French deterrent, compared to the British deterrent, French capabilities are perceived as Europe's leading deterrent that is technologically highly capable and also independent, especially when it comes to its industrial base. That said, Russian military experts probably didn't perceive the French nuclear deterrent as directed towards Russia or at Russia, and this is for two reasons. On one hand, Russian scholars historically tended to perceive the French political leadership as friendlier or less ideologically antagonistic towards Russia as the Americans or the British in their view. And second, traditionally the French nuclear doctrine was based on a strong skepticism about the credibility of the US extending nuclear deterrence, as Paul has already emphasized. So, as the study shows, there are still opportunities to strengthen the two countries' deterrence towards Russia, but I think we are also seeing some important developments in this area, as Emmanuel has already reflected on, for instance, the developments from this summer regarding the enhanced cooperation between the UK and France on nuclear cooperation.
Sophia, that sounded loud and clear to me, so thank you for setting that out. But I wonder, just could you maybe give us a little bit more on the kind of recommendations that the report sort of came to around, that knowing what we now know about how Moscow sees this, if you were advising the British and the French governments, what would be the key areas to focus on, do you think?
Well, I'll take a step back first and say that this was one study focusing on Russian perceptions of the British and French nuclear deterrence. But I think we still have a very limited understanding of Russian strategic thinking, while obviously we are spending quite a lot on defense in Europe. So I think one of the main takeaways from the study is that we need to focus a bit more on understanding what Russia fears And that understanding should inform how we are spending the money that we are spending on European defense. And then I think the other key takeaway from that study is that Russian strategic thinking is obviously different from Western strategic thinking. And the role of nuclear and conventional capabilities are also different in Russian thinking. They are way more horizontal than in Western thinking about deterrence and escalation management. And therefore, I think bringing in conventional capabilities into our deterrence calculus is important. And again, on that, we are seeing some important developments across Europe, but obviously strengthening Europe's domestic advanced conventional capabilities will take time. But I think we are seeing some very important steps on that front.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you so much. Paul, I wonder, I want to get us over to the Q&A fairly soon, but I wonder, Emmanuel as well, if both of you could maybe share some thoughts on this point that Sophia raised right at the end there, around conventional capabilities, and maybe we can unpack that for a couple of minutes a bit more. What I guess essentially, like, you know, beyond nuclear capabilities, what do you see as the key areas that Europe needs to strengthen in terms of conventional weapons? Paul, do you want to have a go first?
Yeah, so building on what Sophia was talking about, so the Russian strategic approach, I think in some ways I would summarize it as a constant pressure, and wherever there's weakness, push harder. Where there is no weakness, maybe stop pushing. And that stands a bit in contrast to the Western way of thinking, which sort of goes in escalation, you know, step by step upwards, where you prefer not to do something, but if pushed to that point, you will reply, and you keep kind of hope that the adversary understands that they should relent. So in that way of thinking, then we have limited options to reciprocate aggression, if Russia resorts to aggression, especially if the US is distracted either domestically or in the Indo-Pacific. So what advanced conventional weapons, and we're talking about long-range precision strike, advanced aircraft, certain kinds of air and missile defense, what these can do is both buy time, right? You can sustain more aggression, and therefore you have the time to come to a decision as an alliance as a whole. You don't have to jump the gun immediately. And it gives you means to target things that Russia would value, or rather, things that Russia needs to sustain a military effort, right? You can hit Russian supply lines and its logistical points, command and control nodes, staging areas, all these kind of things that you would like to have, which would very quickly essentially make a Russian campaign peter out somewhat. And you would want to have something that can do some level of punishment, right? You can hit targets that the Russians care about with conventional means, which is also what the Ukrainians are now doing, right? With the attacks on the Russian energy industry and so on, and defense industry, you would have some options to kind of say, well, we can make this conflict costly for you early on, and we don't have to, you know, we don't even have to get to the question of nuclear weapons very quickly, or even maybe at all, because we will already have damaged you beforehand. And if Russia would then be kind of used a nuclear threat, it's sort of then the British and French weapons are still in operation to deter the worst use of Russian weapons against European value targets, cities, right? I'm trying not to use too much of the jargon here, but there's sort of a sense of, you know, what do you truly value? What do you truly need to sustain a conflict? And what are different levels of that, right? If you destroy a capital city, you're essentially, there's nowhere else to go, right? There's only the sort of this maximum level of violence. On the other hand, if you can destroy other things that are valued or are needed to sustain defense industrial efforts, well, perhaps, you know, that is a good threat, a reasonable threat, and therefore a more believable threat than a weapon that is actually much more powerful, right? So that's a way of thinking about it as well. You essentially, this is sort of a problem from the beginning of the nuclear age. You need weapons that are much less powerful than strategic nuclear weapons to make it believable that you could use strategic nuclear weapons. Because if the only option is sort of 0 and 100, you're probably not going to do anything.
Yeah, thanks so much, Paul. Emmanuel, is there anything you'd like to add on this point around escalation and conventional capabilities as part of that picture?
Maybe very quickly, just to say that from seen from Paris, there's, I think, throughout Cold War history, there's been a little bit this caricature view that the French did not believe that they needed much else to deter aggression because nobody would dare attack thanks to nuclear deterrence. I think we've moved a long way from this, which was never really true, but is even less true today. And the presidential speech were useful in that regard because he's really put forward the idea that especially conventional long strike ballistic missile defense were two specific capacities that were indeed very much useful, as Paul said, to bring credibility to the nuclear deterrence and to avoid this dilemma about all of nothing. So I think this has been useful maybe to state what was obvious to everybody for a long while, but that might have been difficult to articulate with the doctrine. And now that it's quite clear, and there's I think a shared European vision, or at least shared by many partners and states, which is the first step to then push for the capacities and the acquisition of capacities, which is going to take time, whether it is, especially if it is building new capacities from scratch at the European level. So we'll see how long it takes. Maybe one aspect we can mention is that, of course, the technology is here and the ability to produce a very high-tech weapon. The question is really to build the industrial base to build the numbers and to sustain the numbers over a conflict. We've seen that it was a key element during the war in Ukraine, not only just have a couple of missiles that can do a lot of damage, but make sure that you can refuel your launchers. So lots of challenges at the industrial level, and to actually put this strategy and this vision into actual capacity.
Thank you so much. And actually, the point you're just making there about industrial capacity is so important, and it's something that's featured quite a lot in the Q&A. So I wonder if maybe if we move to questions now, and Emmanuel, if you just could maybe give us a few thoughts. There's a couple of different questions here, but maybe we take them broadly together as a group around industrial sort of industrial capacities. So George Oakes has asked, with the growing or reawakening of European military industries, is this creating a countdown for when the door may shut for Russia to make a move against Europe? So you know, what's the kind of timeline that we're talking about in terms of this industrial capacity? And then I think on a related note, we've got a question in from Hannah, also around the EU's role in this space, which obviously a huge component of that is this kind of industrial capacity. We've obviously seen the readiness, the rearm strategy published as well this year. So I wonder if you could maybe tell us a bit about your take on the kind of defense industrial capacity that Europe is developing, and the role perhaps that the EU can play in this picture as well.
Yeah, sure. I think on the industrial side, one of the main challenges is that we've moved from a situation where there was disagreement between European states as to what the best strategy was, but we had the feeling, or at least some of the main arguments that could be heard was like every country was trying to push their own champions, their own industry, their own interests. And now, of course, this might still exist, but we also have different visions that, by the way, I think, exist in the same countries sometimes, which can be, we need capacities fast, so we need to make sure that we get them as fast as we can, which usually means getting them off the shelf, and that might mean getting them from the US. And the other strategic imperative is to develop the European industry, which might be longer, which might be more expensive, but in the long run might bring this autonomy that many countries are feeling is necessary to anticipate the worst case scenario. And actually, both imperatives have a strong strategic rationale, and we can see that they are leading to different types of decisions. It's quite difficult to bring consistency between the two. What is very clear is that on different segments, and on some in particular, building a fully autonomous European industrial base is extremely long. It's going to take a very long time, and a complete refocus and on how things are done. There's been a lot of effort, especially by the EU, to try to structure a defense industry, but we know that it is really a long-term investment, long-term project. And so I think what the EU has been doing has been it is a good step forward, but it is also limited to some extent on the scope it can do. Of course, we know that EU is not the format that can solve some of these issues. We talk a lot about nuclear deterrence. Of course, this is not a conversation we can have at the EU for obvious reasons, because some of the member states are not part of NATO, do not rely on nuclear weapons. On the contrary, we've seen that in other formats, very limited, a couple of states working together, it can also move things forward a little bit faster. So I think there is a complementarity of these formats, NATO being one of them. European NATO countries can work together. In some instance, smaller groupings might be more efficient. One encouraging step is probably the cooperation between NATO and the EU in Brussels. And we hear that, I think, a little bit everywhere, that there's more talk and more interactions now than for a long time. So that can try to avoid duplication and avoid loss of understanding and waste of investment in some ways. So hopefully that can be a good step forward.
Thank you very much. Paula, I'd like to throw another question at you now, if I may. We've got one in from Remco Ruud, who has asked us what we think the apparent change of tone or views from President Trump yesterday might mean for Europe and Ukraine's acting power. Obviously, comments that he made on the sidelines of UNGA around Ukraine being able to actually take back all of its original territory. Do you have any thoughts on what that might mean?
No, thank you, Ben, and thank you for the question. I think it's hard to assess statements by either President Trump or members of administration without taking any political stance. You can see that statements have contradicted themselves, right? And on many different issues, right? Even this week there were the contradictions on the visa issue, on the nature of the visa issues, for example, just completely different. It does seem that President Trump has become somewhat disillusioned with Putin and Russia. He seems to have genuinely have believed that he could solve the Ukraine-Russia war with a few, very quickly, with a few basic interventions. And now that he hasn't, it would suggest, based on the nature of his comments, that maybe another advisor or another kind of advisor has made a different kind of pitch that now he's more receptive to. Maybe being the pitch that Russia is actually not doing nearly as well, that its economy is in a poor state. But I would hesitate to attach too much meaning to it, right? The rhetoric has gone all over the place, because it also, one way to read that statement is also to basically say, to basically take it as, well, Russia's not going to be able to sustain this. So, the Europeans can probably handle this, and Ukraine can probably handle this, and the US does not need to get involved. Right? It is not a ringing endorsement. It's hard to read the tea leaves here, but I don't see it as a ringing endorsement of greater support for NATO, for Ukraine. Right? The only statement of support there is that Europeans can buy US hardware to give to Ukraine, which, is probably an improvement of where we were 2 months ago or a month ago, but it's not really, doesn't tell me that there's deep, enduring commitment to Ukraine or European security.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm conscious of time, but I wanted to try and fit in one more question before we move to kind of concluding thoughts. And we've got a really interesting question in from an anonymous attendee, intriguing, around public opinion and sentiment and how that features in specifically in this question in France's strategic posturing. Emmanuel, I wondered if you wanted to just share a few reflections on this and how important this kind of public opinion dimension is.
Sure, and it allows me to make the link with the report and what Sophia told us about how Moscow is seeing France. I think it's quite well known that there are some political parties that are quite powerful, that have a different vision about Russia. A little bit like the Trump situation, I would say it's not quite clear. They've had different positions, but clearly, seen from Eastern Europe, especially, there is a great caution about what may come from the elections in France. So this is one aspect of it. The other one, of course, is that these parties, especially on the more nationalistic front, are very careful to make sure that France capacities, nuclear deterrence in particular, remain sovereign, autonomous, and that there's no in what way or another, we're not selling the deterrence to Europe or to the EU or whatever might fit the phrase. So there's clearly some movements that exist that are quite vocal, but otherwise, I think over the years, the president has been extremely consistent and on his vision and has developed it. And I think the safeguards have been made also to explain that France would remain, that there was no issue at all about bringing the red button in Brussels or elsewhere. So I think by showing the consistency of the strategy, it's in the mainstream, I would say, quite agreed that there's the vision is consistent with the global position of France in Europe.
Thanks so much, Emmanuel. Sophia, I know that this public opinion question is something that RAND Europe has done some work on previously as well. I wondered if you just wanted to share a few thoughts as well as we come towards the end.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to be brief. So I think especially when we are comparing public opinion in the UK to public opinion in France towards be it nuclear deterrence or defense spending in general, I think public opinion towards defense spending and defense in general is less favorable in the UK. And I think this is also something that is reflected in the Russian perception of European deterrence. In fact, in the study, we found articles, I think from 2016, that highlighted that or suggested that there is actually a possibility that the UK will scrap all its nuclear weapons because of limited public support for it, while when they were discussing French public support for nuclear deterrence, I think Russian scholars understood that there is a stronger public support towards nuclear deterrence in France. So it is definitely something that's featuring in Russian military thinking. But again, this is something that we should also consider in order to make sure that our public is well informed and they understand the reasons why we are spending so much money on defense. And I think we need to spend a bit more time and effort into discussing these topics with the public.
Thank you, Sophia. And thank you to everybody that submitted questions. Apologies that we're going to have to wrap up in the next few minutes. So we'll stop with the question and answer particular section of this event. I just wanted to be very mean to our panelists and just put them on the spot a bit and ask for a brief answer to the same question, kind of in conclusion, which is essentially, obviously, the picture that we've unpacked here. There's a lot of change, there's a lot of transformation going on. There are many different kind of strategic initiatives at the national level and at the multilateral level, NATO, the European Union doing things. There's a lot of activity in this space that we're seeing in 2025. I just wondered, as we close, if you could give us your sense of whether all of this activity is actually leading to a kind of genuine enhancing of Europe's capabilities, as we're sort of endeavoring to deter Russia in this way. Paul, can I put you on the spot and ask you to answer the question first, and just give us your take of, what is all of this activity adding up to?
Sure. I think that's an excellent question. I think for the first time in at least my sort of conscious professional life following these kind of issues, I think we're on the right track. I see all the major European states involved in serious efforts to build capabilities, to talk to each other, to think strategically what is needed, to kind of build support for this with a clear focus on the Russian threat. So that's essentially the good news. We're putting, if you look at, we're putting money where our mouth is, right? If you look at how German defense spending is just shooting up. So this is key, right? Not all states in Europe matter to the same extent if we want to build more cumulative capability. It's great that the Baltic states were always kind of living up to their requirements, but they can't just by their virtue of their size, they can't just put that much weight in a scale. So that Germany is adding to that, that other kind of wealthy smaller states like the Netherlands are adding into that. That's all good news. That said, yeah, it would have been better if this started 10 years ago or longer ago or 5 years ago, or at least when Biden became president. Or anyway, so now time is not on our side. And I think that's the biggest problem. So are we doing the right things? Are we asking the right questions? Are we coming up with good answers? Are we understanding that we need even better answers? Yes, that's all true. And that's all good news. Do we have the time to do this? And especially when we have an adversary that is by its nature knows that it's sort of running out of time, and that is also by its nature very opportunistic, right? Russia looks for weaknesses and pushes there. And there is simply in the coming, you know, half year, in the coming maybe 2, 3, 4 years, there's still really a lot of opportunity to kind of pick the spots where we're still soft, where where our new capabilities haven't come online yet, or have not come online in serious capabilities, or we haven't thought of a scenario and we haven't discussed it with each other. That's sort of where we're weak. There's time is not on our side. We need to not just build the hardware for this, we need to build the habits of doing this.
Thanks so much, Paul. Sophia, I'll come to you next. What's your take?
Very briefly, yes, I agree with Paul. I think we're seeing some very important developments are strengthening European defense and deterrence. Although I would also highlight that these processes take a very long time and will need sustained political support for it, sustained funding, and sustained public support over the years in order for it to be successful in the long term.
Perfect. Thank you. And Emmanuel, last word to you. Your thoughts
Thank
on
you
this
so
question?
Sure. Well, I think there are still major hurdles. We mentioned some industrial competition between states, the fact that, of course, as sovereign nations, they each have their own requirements and priorities, which might not make a lot of collective sense. But I would also be quite optimistic in a way. I think the solidarity, especially that has been shown in the latest instances that we discussed, the willingness of states to show that they were supportive is very good. And I hope we can really build on that to build even things that may not require a lot of new capacities that, as Paul said, are going to come and take time, but just more coordination and pulling together what we have in a better way, I think can already have an important effect.
That's fantastic. And an optimistic note on which to end. Thank you very much, Paul, Emmanuel, Sophia. That was a wonderful set of reflections there. Really appreciated the discussion. Thank you to everybody who tuned in to listen today. Really great that you could join us. And we hope that we can see you soon at another Rand Europe webinar. If you'd like to find out a bit more about the work that Rand Europe is doing on these questions, then please visit our website. The link has been shared in the chat. So many different projects going on around these kind of European security questions at the moment. And if you would like to be kept in the loop about future events and research, then you can also sign up to our mailing list on the website there as well. All that remains for me to say is enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you very much again to our speakers for joining us. Thank you. Goodbye.